Just before dawn, the blizzard finally stopped. On a frozen mountain road, a man noticed something that didn't belong there. Fresh dog tracks pressed deep into the snow, moving straight into the storm. No hesitation, no turning back. Whoever this dog was, it wasn't running away. It was looking for help. And when he decided to follow those tracks, he had no idea what waited at the end or how many lives it would change. Before dawn, the blizzard finally loosened its grip. The wind fell silent, the sky pale and heavy, and the mountain road lay buried beneath fresh, unmoving snow. Daniel Harper had lived in these hills long enough to recognize the difference between danger and aftermath. The silence was not peaceful. It was watchful. He stood just inside the edge of the road, boots sunk deep into the powder, shoulders squared against the cold out of habit more than necessity. At 62, Daniel was no longer broad in the way he had been during his years in uniform, but his frame remained solid, built by decades of discipline rather than comfort. His hair, once dark, had thinned and turned steel gray, cut short in a way he had never bothered to change. A trimmed beard lined his jaw, rough with frost, softening sharp cheekbones that still hinted at the man he had been. Daniel was a retired SWAT officer, though the title meant less to him now than the quiet routines he had carved out since leaving the force. He had come to the mountains not to escape people, but to live somewhere honesty still existed in the land itself. The storms were brutal, the winters unforgiving, but nothing pretended to be what it wasn't. He had stepped outside only to check the road, something he did every morning after a storm, a habit formed from years of responsibility. Fallen branches, blocked paths, signs of trouble. That was when he saw them. Footprints. They cut across the road at a shallow angle, pressed deep into the snow and still sharply defined, not scattered, not frantic. Each print landed with intention, a steady rhythm that spoke of movement rather than panic. Daniel crouched slightly, ignoring the ache in his knees, and studied them more closely. Dog tracks, large ones. The pads were wide, the stride long but even. Whoever this dog was, it hadn't been running blindly. It had been traveling, covering ground with purpose. Daniel followed the line of prints with his eyes as they disappeared into the pale distance, stretching farther than they should have. Most animals sheltered during storms like the one that had passed. Dogs especially knew better than to wander miles through whiteout conditions. Instinct alone would have driven them to cover. Yet these tracks told a different story. "They're fresh," Daniel muttered to himself, his breath fogging the air. He straightened slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No sound came back to him except the faint creak of snow settling. Somewhere deep in the woods, a branch snapped under its own weight. That was all. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, but alertness. The kind that never truly leaves men who spent their lives responding to situations most people never see. Retirement dulled the edges, but it never erased the instinct. The dog had crossed the road heading uphill toward the ridge where the forest thickened and the terrain turned uneven. Daniel knew that area well. The slope was treacherous even in summer. In winter, it became a maze of drifts, fallen timber, and hidden ice. He told himself there were reasonable explanations. Someone's dog could have gotten loose. A hunter might have passed through before the storm fully closed in. But reason didn't sit well with what he was seeing. The stride length didn't falter. The direction never changed. This dog hadn't been wandering. Daniel exhaled slowly and followed the tracks a short distance off the road, just enough to confirm what his gut already knew. The prints continued, unwavering, disappearing between snow-laden pines. No backtracking, no circling. "Damn it," he said quietly. Turning back would have been easier, sensible even. The storm had only just ended. Temperatures were still dropping. He was alone. and no one would question his decision to leave it be. But that wasn't how Daniel Harper had lived his life. 30 years in law enforcement had taught him that unanswered questions were often warnings ignored too late. He adjusted the collar of his heavy coat and checked the small pack slung over his shoulder. Radio, flashlight, emergency kit. Old habits again. He hadn't realized how naturally his body slipped back into readiness until now. As he followed the trail deeper into the woods, Daniel's thoughts drifted to the one thing that still haunted him from his career. Not the violence, not the loss, but the moments when he arrived too late. The calls that ended with silence instead of relief. Those memories had shaped him more than any commendation ever had, hardening his resolve and sharpening his sense of responsibility. He had learned early that hesitation cost lives. The tracks led him along the edge of a frozen creek, then upward toward a stand of trees battered by the storm. Snow clung to their trunks like pale scars. Here, the footprints faltered briefly, the strides shortening, then resumed. The dog had slipped, fallen, gotten back up. Daniel stopped, crouching again. He reached out and touched the edge of one print, feeling the compacted snow beneath his glove. Still firm, still recent. "This wasn't easy for you," he murmured, speaking to the empty woods. That was when he saw the dog. It stood about 30 yards ahead, partially obscured by drifting snow and low-hanging branches. A German shepherd, large, powerful, its thick coat a mix of black and tan dusted white along the spine. The dog looked mature, not young, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. Its posture was rigid but controlled, legs planted firmly, head lifted. Its ears were upright, alert. Its eyes, dark, intelligent, locked onto Daniel with an intensity that stopped him cold. The dog did not bark. It did not growl. It simply stood there, chest rising and falling too fast for comfort, breath visible in sharp bursts. There was exhaustion in the way it held itself, but no fear, no aggression. Daniel slowly raised his hands, palms open, his movements deliberate. "Easy," he said softly. His voice carried the calm authority that years of crisis negotiation had etched into it. "I'm not here to hurt you." The dog watched him for a long moment, unmoving. Then it turned its head slightly, glancing back toward the deeper forest, before looking at Daniel again. One step forward, then another backward glance. It was an invitation or a plea. Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. This wasn't a lost animal. This was a messenger. Whatever lay ahead was serious enough that the dog had risked the storm, the cold, and its own strength to find help. "All right," Daniel said quietly. "Show me." The dog turned without hesitation and began moving uphill, slower now, favoring one hind leg just enough to be noticeable. Daniel followed, heart steady, mind clear. He did not know what waited beyond the trees. He only knew that turning back was no longer an option. Behind them, the road disappeared under fresh snowfall, erasing the last trace of where Daniel had come from. Ahead, the dog pressed on, each step deliberate, carrying with it the unspoken urgency of a life depending on what happened next. The dog moved ahead at a measured pace, no longer rushing, conserving what little strength it had left. Snow clung to its thick coat, collecting along the black ridge of its back and in the long fur beneath its chest. Daniel followed several steps behind, careful to place his boots where the dog had already passed, trusting its instincts over his own judgment of the terrain. The forest thickened as they climbed. Pines stood close together, their branches bowed under the weight of the storm, forming narrow corridors of shadow even in the growing light. The dog chose its path with quiet certainty, skirting fallen logs, avoiding drifts that hid ice beneath soft powder. This was not luck. This was experience. Daniel noticed the way the dog occasionally slowed, favoring its right hind leg just enough to betray fatigue. The movement was subtle, controlled, the kind of restraint learned over time. It told him the dog had pushed past its limits long before finding him. "You've been doing this a while," Daniel murmured, not expecting an answer. The dog paused once, ears flicking back, as if acknowledging the sound of his voice, then continued forward. They reached the edge of a frozen service road, barely visible beneath layers of wind-packed snow. The dog crossed without hesitation, placing each paw carefully. Daniel tested the surface with his boot before following. The ice held, but only just. A slip here would mean injury. In these temperatures, injury meant time, and time was something neither of them had. As they moved along the road, Daniel studied the dog more closely. The German Shepherd was lean but powerful, its muscles defined beneath the coat despite visible exhaustion. Its muzzle was dusted with gray, suggesting middle age. The eyes, dark brown, alert, never stopped scanning ahead. This dog wasn't just following scent, it was remembering a route. That realization tightened something in Daniel's chest. The road curved toward a shallow ravine where the forest opened briefly, exposing the land to the wind. Snow lay deeper here, drifted into uneven waves. The dog stumbled once, catching itself before falling. Daniel quickened his pace instinctively, closing the distance between them. "Easy," he said quietly. The dog stopped, breathing hard. Steam rose from its mouth in rapid bursts. Daniel knelt a few feet away, keeping his posture low, non-threatening. Up close, he could see the fine cracks in the dog's paw pads, reddened from cold and ice. The journey had taken its toll. "You should have stayed put," Daniel said softly, though he knew that wasn't true. If the dog had stayed, whatever waited ahead would already be lost. After a moment, the dog straightened, determination returning to its stance. It turned its head once more toward the ravine and resumed walking. Beyond the dip in the land, the tracks changed. Daniel noticed it immediately. The stride shortened. The print sank deeper, uneven now. The dog had slipped again here, more than once. It had fallen hard enough for its body to leave an imprint beside the paw marks. And still, it had gotten up. Daniel stopped briefly, his jaw tightening. He'd seen that kind of persistence before, not in animals, but in people who refused to quit because someone else depended on them. It wasn't bravery. It was obligation. They descended carefully, the dog leading them along the edge of the ravine rather than straight through it. At the bottom, half buried beneath snow and fallen branches, lay the remains of an old wire fence. Rusted posts leaned at odd angles, some snapped entirely. The dog slowed, then halted. Daniel's breath caught. The air felt different here, still colder somehow. Sound seemed to vanish, swallowed by the snowbanks. The dog turned its head and looked at Daniel, eyes wide, unblinking. "Here," Daniel said under his breath. The dog stepped forward, nosing at a mound of snow pressed against the broken fence. It pawed once, weakly, then stepped aside. Daniel moved past it, kneeling and brushing snow away with gloved hands. Beneath the surface, fabric emerged, dark, stiff with ice. A woman lay there, partially shielded by the collapsed fence and a natural dip in the ground. She was small, her frame slender, even beneath layers of winter clothing. Long auburn hair spilled from beneath a knit cap, tangled and frozen in places. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, lips tinged blue. She could have been anywhere from her mid-30s to early 40s. The cold blurred those lines. Daniel leaned close, searching for signs of life. At first, he thought there were none. Then he saw it, a faint rise beneath her coat, a breath, shallow, fragile, but there. "Hey," he said softly, "stay with me." Her name, he would later learn, was Sarah Whitman. She was a wildlife surveyor who had lived most of her life outdoors, tall and lean, accustomed to solitude. Friends described her as quiet, observant, someone who spoke little but noticed everything. A recent accident, an icy fall weeks earlier, had left her more cautious than before, more hesitant to trust her footing. That caution had likely saved her life by keeping her near the fence when she fell, rather than tumbling deeper into the ravine. But Daniel did not know any of that yet. He checked her pulse. Slow, weak, Hypothermia had already taken hold. He moved quickly now, years of training cutting through the cold. He wrapped her in an emergency blanket from his pack, insulating her from the snow. The dog stood close, watching every movement, body tense, tail low. "You did good," Daniel said, meeting the dog's eyes. For the first time, the shepherd stepped forward and pressed its head gently against Sarah's shoulder. The contact was deliberate, protective. This wasn't a stray that had stumbled upon her. This was her dog. Daniel understood then why the journey hadn't been abandoned. Above them, clouds began to shift, thin bands of light breaking through the gray. The storm had passed, but its consequences remained. Daniel knew the road back would be slow, dangerous. But there was no question now. The dog had brought him exactly where he needed to be. And it wasn't finished yet. The first thing Daniel understood was that time was no longer measured in minutes. It was measured in heat. Sarah Whitman lay wrapped in the emergency blanket, her body unnaturally still beneath its thin metallic sheen. Daniel pressed 2 fingers gently against the side of her neck again, counting the slow, uneven pulse. Each beat felt fragile, as if it might be the last. Hypothermia did not announce itself loudly. It stole warmth quietly, patiently, until there was nothing left to take. Daniel forced himself to slow his breathing. Panic wasted energy, and energy was survival. He scanned the ravine with quick, practiced movements. The collapsed fence had broken the wind, and the shallow dip in the land had trapped what little warmth the earth still held. It wasn't much, but it was the reason Sarah was still alive. "She held on," Daniel said softly, more to himself than anyone else. The German shepherd stood inches from Sarah's side, body angled toward Daniel now, ears flicking at every sound. Snow clung to its whiskers, and its breath still came hard, but its eyes were steady. There was intelligence there, awareness. It understood this moment mattered. Daniel slipped off his outer gloves and checked Sarah's hands. Her fingers were stiff, pale, curled inward. Frostbite was a risk, but hypothermia would kill her first. He resisted the urge to rub warmth back into her limbs. He knew better. Sudden movement could send cold blood rushing to her heart. Everything had to be gradual. He reached into his pack and pulled out a thermal wrap, layering it carefully over the emergency blanket, creating a pocket of insulation. Then, he placed his own coat over her torso, sacrificing his comfort without hesitation. He had endured worse cold than this. She had not. "Stay with me, Sarah," he said, using her name for the first time, though he didn't know yet if she could hear it. Her eyelids fluttered faintly. That small movement changed everything. The dog reacted instantly, stepping forward, lowering its head until its nose nearly touched Sarah's cheek. It let out a low sound, not a bark, not a whine, something softer. Daniel felt it vibrate through the quiet like a promise. "All right," Daniel said, "we're getting you out." The problem was distance. The ravine sat far from the road, and the terrain between here and shelter was unforgiving. Carrying her was impossible. Dragging her would worsen her condition. Daniel considered his options, his mind working through variables the way it always had under pressure. He checked his radio. Static. The storm had damaged the signal. No immediate help was coming. Daniel looked at the dog. "Can you walk?" The shepherd shifted its weight, then took a careful step, favoring its injured leg but holding firm. It wasn't strong, but it wasn't done. Daniel nodded once. "Good." He fashioned a makeshift sled using fallen branches, rope from his pack, and the stiff wire from the broken fence. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional. He lined it with insulation and secured Sarah gently, ensuring her head and chest remained elevated. Throughout it all, the dog stayed close, watching every movement, stepping in only when Daniel paused. At one point, when Sarah's arm slipped, the shepherd nudged it back into place with surprising care. "You've done this before," Daniel murmured. The dog didn't respond, but its eyes never left Sarah. The climb out of the ravine was slow. Pain flared in Daniel's legs, his breath burning his chest, but he welcomed it. pain meant circulation. Cold numbness was the real enemy. He pulled, rested, pulled again, every motion deliberate. Halfway up, Sarah stirred. Her lips moved, a sound barely audible escaping them. Daniel leaned close. "I'm here." Her eyes opened just enough to reveal pale blue irises, unfocused but present. She tried to speak again, failed, then swallowed. "Dog," she whispered. Daniel smiled despite himself. "He didn't leave you." The shepherd pressed closer at the sound of her voice, tail giving the smallest twitch. By the time they reached the tree line, daylight had strengthened, though the air remained brutal. Daniel's hands shook from exertion as much as cold. He paused long enough to give Sarah a measured sip of warm liquid from his thermos, careful not to force it. The road came into view, buried but recognizable. Daniel felt relief, but not safety yet. Vehicles could reach the road, but only if he could signal someone. That was when he heard it. An engine, faint, distant, but real. Daniel straightened, heart pounding. He waved his arms, then reached for the flare from his pack. He fired it upward, the red streak cutting sharply through the pale sky. Moments later, a snowmobile crested the bend in the road. The rider dismounted quickly, a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, face weathered by years of cold. His beard was thick and untrimmed, dark with streaks of gray. His name was Thomas Reed, a local volunteer with the Mountain Search Group. Quiet, reliable, the kind of man who never asked why someone needed help, only where. "What have we got?" Thomas asked, already kneeling. "Hypothermia," Daniel replied. "Severe." Thomas nodded once. No panic, just action. Together, they stabilized Sarah and secured her for transport. As they worked, the German shepherd finally allowed itself to lie down beside her, exhaustion overtaking vigilance now that help had arrived. Daniel rested a hand briefly on the dog's shoulder. "You did it." The shepherd closed its eyes, just for a moment. As the snowmobile pulled away toward safety, Daniel remained standing in the road, watching until it disappeared from view. The cold crept back in, settling into his bones. But for the first time since the storm ended, it no longer felt victorious. The hospital room was warm in a way that felt almost unreal. Daniel noticed it the moment he stepped inside, the steady hum of heat, the soft lighting, the faint scent of antiseptic replacing pine and snow. After days of cold and motion, stillness felt unfamiliar, even unsettling. He stood near the doorway at first, hands in his coat pockets, unsure where he belonged now that the emergency had passed. Sarah Whitman lay propped up in the narrow bed, wrapped in white sheets instead of silver blankets. Color had returned to her face, though she still looked fragile, as if the storm had taken something from her it hadn't yet given back. Her auburn hair was loose now, washed and combed, falling in soft waves to her shoulders. Without the ice and grime, she looked younger, late 30s, Daniel guessed, with sharp cheekbones and thoughtful blue eyes that missed nothing, even in exhaustion. A heart monitor ticked steadily beside her, each beep a quiet reassurance. She turned her head when she sensed him there. "You came back," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. Daniel nodded once. "Wanted to make sure you were all right." Sarah studied him for a moment, the way people who spend their lives observing animals often studied humans, without judgment, only curiosity. Daniel was tall, his posture straight even now, shoulders set as if bracing against weather that wasn't there. The lines in his face spoke of years lived carefully, and a few lived dangerously. His eyes were calm but distant, shaped by too many nights like the one they'd survived. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know," Daniel replied, "but I wanted to." The door opened quietly, and the German shepherd entered, led by a nurse holding a loose leash. The dog moved slowly, favoring its injured leg, but its presence filled the small room immediately. Its coat had been cleaned, the black and tan fur brushed smooth, though faint scars along its flank hinted at a life lived outdoors. The dog was older than Daniel had first thought, closer to 7, perhaps 8, but the intelligence in its eyes had not dulled. "That's Bear," Sarah said, a small smile breaking through her fatigue. "He's been with me since he was a year old." Bear's ears lifted at the sound of her voice. He crossed the room and lay down beside her bed with a sigh that carried days of exhaustion. Sarah reached out, resting her hand against his neck. "He's stubborn," she added softly. "Once he decides something matters, there's no stopping him." Daniel believed that. A doctor appeared briefly, a woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, efficient and kind. Dr. Elaine Foster spoke plainly, explaining that Sarah had suffered moderate hypothermia but would recover fully. No permanent damage. A close call. "Another hour out there," the doctor said, "and this would be a different conversation." Daniel nodded, the weight of that sentence settling heavily. Later, when the room was quiet again, Sarah looked at him. "I didn't think anyone would find me," she admitted. "The storm came faster than forecast. I slipped, hit my leg, couldn't stand. I sent Bear away because I knew if he stayed, we'd both freeze." Daniel said nothing. He understood that choice. It took a certain kind of courage to send help away without knowing if it would return. "He didn't want to go," Sarah continued, "but he listened. He always does, eventually." Daniel glanced at Bear, now asleep, his body finally relaxed. "He remembered the road," Daniel said. "The way back." Sarah's eyes filled slightly, though she didn't cry. "He remembers everything." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't demand words. Outside the window, snow continued to fall lightly, harmless now. Daniel stood to leave when visiting hours ended. He paused at the door. "I live not far from where I found you," he said. "If you need anything while you recover." Sarah smiled, tired but genuine. "I think we already took enough from you." Daniel shook his head. "Some things aren't taken. They're shared." In the days that followed, Sarah recovered quickly. The hospital discharged her sooner than expected, thanks to her overall health and stubborn resilience. Daniel helped arrange transport back to her cabin, a modest structure farther up the mountain than his own, built for function rather than comfort. When they arrived, Bear limped out of the truck and surveyed the familiar ground, tail lifting slightly. The cabin bore signs of the storm, snow piled high, a shutter torn loose, but it stood, like its owner. Inside, Sarah moved carefully, leaning on a cane the hospital had given her. Daniel repaired what he could without being asked, fixed the shutter, cleared the path. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. As daylight faded, Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee, strong and bitter, the way people who spend time alone tend to prefer it. She handed one to Daniel. "You don't talk much," she said. "Used to talking when it mattered," Daniel replied. She nodded. "I understand that." Bear lay between them near the fire, his breathing slow and even. The storm had passed. The danger was over. But something else had begun, something quieter, less dramatic, and far harder to name. A connection forged, not by words, but by shared silence, and the simple truth that sometimes survival binds people together in ways nothing else can. Daniel finished his coffee and stood. "I should head back," Sarah didn't argue. "Will I see you again?" Daniel looked at the road outside, then back at her. "Mountains are small places," he said. "People cross paths." As he stepped into the cold evening air, Daniel realized something had shifted. The storm had taken its toll, but it had also given something back, not closure, but purpose. The mountain did not change after the storm. It simply revealed itself again. Snow still covered the ground in thick, uneven layers, pressed hard by cold nights and pale mornings. The road outside Daniel Harper's cabin had reopened, though only a narrow path remained, carved by passing plows and patience. Life returned the way it always did up here, slowly, quietly, without ceremony. Daniel noticed the silence first, not the dangerous silence of a blizzard, but the deeper kind that settles when urgency fades. For years, that silence had been his companion. He had chosen it after retirement, believing distance from people would quiet the memories that followed him out of the city. Some nights, it worked. Other nights, it didn't. He stood at his kitchen window, a mug of coffee cooling untouched in his hands, watching the familiar line of trees beyond his property. That morning, for the first time since the rescue, he did not feel the pull to check the road. No compulsion to search for trouble. Instead, he found himself thinking of Sarah Whitman. She had returned to her cabin a week earlier, moving carefully, her body still rebuilding strength. Daniel had stopped by once to drop off firewood, nothing more, nothing less. He told himself it was practical. The truth was quieter. Bear had greeted him before Sarah reached the door. The German shepherd moved with a slight stiffness now, age and injury making themselves known, but his presence remained steady. His coat had regained its shine, thick and well cared for, though gray had begun to trace the edges of his muzzle. Bear watched Daniel the way working dogs watched people, alert, measuring, not unfriendly, but cautious. Daniel respected that. "You're healing," Daniel had said to him then. Bear had responded with a single slow blink. Now, standing alone again, Daniel pulled on his coat. The decision felt simple, though he knew it wasn't. He drove the familiar stretch of road toward Sarah's place, the engine humming beneath him like a reminder that motion still existed in his life. Sarah answered the door before he knocked. She looked stronger than she had a week ago. Color had fully returned to her face, and her posture was more upright, though she still leaned lightly against the door frame. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose braid, strands escaping to catch the light. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, not from illness, but from adjustment. Recovery was work. "You didn't have to come," she said, though there was no dismissal in her tone. "I know," Daniel replied, "but I wanted to." She stepped aside to let him in. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee. It was modest but purposeful, built by someone who valued shelter over decoration. Books lined one wall, field journals, maps, worn paperbacks, evidence of a life spent paying attention. Bear lay near the hearth, rising when Daniel entered. He approached slowly, then stopped just short, sniffed the air, and sat. Acceptance, not submission. Daniel nodded to him. "Good to see you on your feet." Sarah poured coffee while Daniel set down the extra firewood. They sat across from each other at the small table, steam rising between them. "I keep replaying it," Sarah said finally, "the moment I sent him away." Daniel didn't interrupt. "I thought, if he stayed, he'd die with me. I didn't know if he'd find anyone, or if anyone would follow him." "You trusted him anyway," Daniel said. Sarah nodded. "I trusted who he is." Daniel felt the words settle into something familiar. Trust. Responsibility. The things that had shaped his life long before he ever wore a badge. "Why didn't you turn back?" Sarah asked him then, "when you saw the tracks?" Daniel considered the question. No one had asked him that before. "Because I've spent too many years knowing what happens when people do," he said at last. "I didn't want to carry another unanswered ending." Sarah absorbed that quietly. They finished their coffee in silence. Outside, Bear stood and walked to the door, pausing there. He looked back once, waiting. Sarah smiled faintly. "He still checks on the world." Daniel opened the door for them both. They stood together on the porch, the cold sharp but manageable. The mountains stretched around them, unchanged and honest. "I won't be here forever," Sarah said. "Once I'm fully recovered, I'll head back down for a while." Daniel nodded. "Mountains don't ask people to stay." Bear stepped forward, pressing his shoulder briefly against Daniel's leg. The contact was solid, intentional, not affection, recognition. Daniel rested his hand there for a moment. As he drove home later, Daniel realized something had shifted in a way he hadn't expected. The rescue had not filled the emptiness he once carried. It had clarified it. He no longer wanted silence without purpose. The following weeks settled into a new rhythm. Daniel checked the road again each morning, but now he did it with a different awareness. Not because he was waiting for the next emergency, but because he understood why he had always looked. Sarah recovered fully. Bear regained his strength, though he moved slower now, choosing comfort over patrol. They crossed paths often, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. There were no promises made, no plans spoken aloud, only presence. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Daniel stood outside his cabin and watched Bear lie down in the snow, perfectly content, eyes half closed. The dog had walked through a storm to find help. Daniel had followed him. Neither of them had known what waited on the other side, but both had stayed. Sometimes the most important help doesn't come from strength or speed, but from refusing to walk away. In everyday life, we all leave footprints without realizing it. Small choices, quiet moments of care, and the decision to keep going when no one is watching. This story isn't just about a man, a woman, or a dog. It's about what happens when loyalty meets responsibility, and when someone chooses to act instead of hoping someone else will. If this story reminded you of a moment in your own life when you or someone you love didn't give up, I'd really like to hear about it in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Thank you for spending this time with us. Another story is waiting for you.